There's a storm across the valley. The clouds are rolling in. The afternoon is heavy on your shoulders. There's a truck out on the 4-lane, a mile or more away. The whining of his wheels just makes it colder.
Welcome to Community Forum. Today is October 12th, 2022, and my name is Priscilla Almquist-Olsen, your host for Community Forum, and it gives me a great deal of pleasure to welcome Justin LeWinter, who owns the Josiah Keith House, Easton's oldest house, built in 1717, and one of our two town historians, Ed Hands, who is an expert on not just history, but on Josiah Keith and the families. So, well, you're going to be an expert for today. Anyway, I understand that the two of you have met before and have shared stories and information, and so now we have a chance to share that information with the wider Easton community, and I'm really looking forward to learning a great deal. So, and we had this morning a tour that Justin led of the house, which will be accompanying this interview. So please sit back, enjoy, and learn a little bit of history about Easton and its past. So, Justin, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Hello. Welcome. So tell me, how did you acquire the house?
I was looking for an older house that had some property, and I was searching through the internet, and I happened to have found this website, Circa, Old Houses, and the house was listed on there. And I happened to be the first person to go see it, and the last person to go see it. I fell in love with it from the moment I walked in the door. It's a beautiful example.
And tell us, what did you really like most about it?
The early wood paneling, the pumpkin pie paneling, and the staircase, and the hearth in the kitchen. It was quite charming. And
there are boards of wood that are 14 inches wide in that house. It's just amazing.
Oh, yeah.
There are floorboards, but the wood was used for walls.
Oh, for everything.
And ceiling. Yeah.
Yeah. The Keith family owned the sawmill in the town, and they certainly showed it off.
Yes, and so all of those, you can see the planing that was done on the wood.
Beautiful, beautiful work.
So they had the means to do that, and they certainly did a wonderful job. So you have searched, I understand, quite a long time to find an older house.
Yeah, I was looking for a few years.
And how long have you been in this house?
At least it's been a year now, as of September or August.
So you've really done some wonderful work and appointments. Ed, tell me a little bit about the history of Josiah Keith's house.
Well, it was one of the first houses to be built in Easton, and now is the oldest house in Easton. Mm-hmm. And Josiah Keith, the original Josiah Keith, the first of three, was the son of Reverend James Keith of West Bridgewater. His house still stands in West Bridgewater. The West Bridgewater Old Bridgewater Historical Society owns the house, and you can visit it by appointment. And what happened was Reverend Keith had dairy cattle, and had his son bring his cows over to Easton because the land around what's now the Josiah Keith house was old Indian fields and had kind of reverted to pasture. So they would bring the animals over in the summertime, pasture them, and then bring them home. And ultimately it became, well, we're here part of the year, we might as well build a corn crib, and then 4 years later build a house. So that's how it got started.
Very good. And Justin, what are your early? What you've researched this house and
We
you've
did.
researched the people. So tell me a little bit about after Reverend James Keith, who was the father of the first Josiah, right? So how many
Yes.
Josiahs were there?
There were three of them. Josiah's father, James, was an interesting man, involved with a lot. He was under the tutelage of Increase Mather when he was brought over from Scotland at the age of 16, I think, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was sent up to Harvard, and then he had his own family after dealing with King Philip's War, where I believe he saved.
That's the legend.
That's
Yep.
the legend. The
Yep.
legend is he saved King Philip's son and wife from being beheaded. And then he was involved with many other things that had been going on in the area, but he had his own family. He had quite a number of children, large number of children, just as most families did. So Josiah was born sometime around 1660 or something, 1660.
Yeah, he was not the oldest son.
No, he was not, which is, he wouldn't have usually inherited land, which was quite strange. As Ed said earlier, they were there in Easton half the year when he was driving his father's cattle, and they built the corn crib. I imagine that they probably spent many a night in that corn crib, sleeping above their animals, and yeah, they built a beautiful, beautiful, beautiful house, which I have the fortune to live in.
Which doesn't look like it originally did.
No.
So that's an interesting part of the story and an interesting part of what you see when you tour the house.
Sometime in the 1790s, it was rotted on the second floor, correct?
No, it was
the first
supposedly
floor.
the sills, and
They lowered the whole thing.
they lowered the whole
So
thing.
it was originally a full cape, and now it's a half cape.
Which probably accounts for those steep stairs, too.
Oh, yeah. For sure, for sure. Quite dangerous, but the case with most houses of the period, they were quite dangerous. It's still a beautiful, beautiful house, and I'm very lucky.
So the first Josiah, so James was a friend of Increase Mather,
Yes.
who eventually became the president of Harvard.
Yeah.
And he had a son, Cotton Mather, and I think we're very familiar with that name,
Of course.
Cotton Mather. And he was a very strict Puritan.
Yeah.
And but anyway,
Josiah probably would have met Cotton Mather when his father died, and Cotton Mather read James's eulogy, which that's quite a significant thing, especially at the time. The Mather family were extremely important, extremely, extremely important.
So what about the second Josiah?
He was the captain of the town militia as well.
Both the second and third
Yeah.
were militia people. I know more about the third than I do about the second.
Yeah, I know a little bit about him. He went and fought in upstate New York during the French and Indian War. There's not a lot of information, as Ed said. He did come back. He was successful. His businesses thrived. Apparently, the Keith family owned where the mobile station is on the Five Corners, a tavern, and the lumber mill was still in use at the time, or
That's problematical. I think the lumber mill on the site was actually later rather than earlier. The family had a sawmill, and the Keith family, as we know, was huge. So there were Keiths down on South Street that had a sawmill, and that may be where your lumber came from. That's 1717 is early enough that some poor guy was in the bottom of a pit with a pit saw.
yeah. Been fortunate enough that I have a lot of the later period pole saws that are left from the previous owners, the Williams family, on the property.
Yeah.
Right.
But Josiah Josiah III ended up inheriting the tavern.
Yes.
And that made you a very prominent person because you were the master of all media. Newspapers would come into town and they'd
Yes.
be there at your place. The mail oftentimes would be delivered there as well. And
Probably why he became
an
town,
officer.
Yeah, he became a town officer. He became a selectman.
Yeah. He also ended up borrowing a lot of money.
Yes.
And partly because the Bay Road became less and less important as what we call today 138 was turned into a turnpike, which was a nice, smooth road, whereas Bay Road was always falling apart. So
does run through the middle of a swamp.
Yeah.
So
people switched over. He ran up a huge debt, and he committed suicide.
he did.
No.
Yes.
Very sad.
Yes.
How
Very
old was
sad.
he?
He was fairly old.
Yeah.
Early 70s, maybe.
Yeah. He was
Maybe
in
not
his,
quite
he was
that
in
old.
his 70s.
But
Because he was in his 40s during the Revolution.
Yeah.
And this was around 1790.
1803.
1803.
The fabulous year of 1803,
Yeah.
when the thieves horse thieves we were talking about were arrested in 1803, and not in the horse thief category, but Oliver Ames came to town in 1803. So what they did with Josiah, because if you were a suicide, you weren't supposed to be buried in sacred ground.
Yes.
I don't think that mattered very much to people, but the fact that he died owing everybody in town
Yeah.
made them mad enough that they buried him at a 90-degree angle to everybody else in the cemetery.
Yes.
Where he still is, which unfortunately led to an interesting story. You may remember Duncan Oliver, who was principal
Sure.
at high school for a long time, and he heard all the old stories from Kippy Grant. So one day he noticed that the DPW had adjusted the stone. And he said, "That's not right." So he came back at night and switched the stone back, and a police officer came, and he had to explain what was going on, but it all worked out for the best.
He had a quite interesting career in the militia as well, as the militia captain under, what regiment was he with? I can't remember his name, his commander. Anyway, he was involved in a lot of stuff. As Ed said, he was the owner of the inn. He heard lots of news. Apparently, there's some references that he was down in Providence when some of the British ships were burning. He was then late to the Battle of Lexington and Concord. He was I believe he was in Bunker Hill as well. And so I think I read he marched all the way out to the Battle of New York in Brooklyn, which this man, that's a lot to see.
He served for quite a while.
Yeah.
I want to defend him a little bit because
He's a good man.
Late to the Battle of Lexington and Concord, we didn't hear about
Yeah.
the Battle of Lexington and Concord until after it was over. And we actually have a first-person account. If you were aiming for a pension, you had to prove that you were a soldier in the war. And so Unite Keith, a relative, applied for his pension, and his younger brother, who was 8 years old when the war started, told the story. A militia officer came running into the furnace, which is down at Old Pond, came running into the furnace and said, "Turn out, turn out." Well, the nearest militia person was his cousin, Josiah Keith, so I think that's Josiah getting the guys to turn out. But a minute was sort of approximate, and the guys actually had a night march to Boston. So they arrived not only after the battle, but after the British were back in Boston.
Yes. There was something else interesting about him as well. He apparently had tried to get one of the other militia members slaves to join them, which would have been quite interesting. That there usually wouldn't be the mixing of races, which is a sensitive topic, but I think he was a relatively good man at heart, even though he had financial problems.
He actually succeeded in getting this. Right down the street from your tavern was the Matthew Hayward Tavern. And there was a person there who was a slave. Probably from the best of our knowledge, like most slaves in New England, he was a prestige possession.
Yes.
And probably served in the tavern. And this man was named Anton Haywood, or Anthony Haywood. And he did serve, and the rule was if you enlisted, he did it as a substitute for his master, who was a town official, you could get your freedom. And he did.
That's quite wonderful.
Yeah, I'm actually working on a paper that I'm going to be delivering, ironically enough, to the Historical Society at the end of the month. So you can hear more about that later.
Yeah, we'll have to show up. Apparently the Keiths owned a slave as well, and from what I've heard or was reading, that they gave her a stipend after she was freed. And is this somewhat true?
Well, slavery legally was abolished in Massachusetts in 1783, and it was in all the papers except for the fact that there was like one paper, so most people didn't hear about it.
Of course.
And this poor woman didn't hear about it for 7 more years.
Oh, geez.
And then the census taker for the first census came around and said, how many, free blacks, or, what do you mean free blacks? Well, slavery was abolished 7 years ago. So they had her sign a document saying she would stay with the family, and then when James Dean died, she would get her stipend, which was a lot like the minimum wage I'm getting here. It's hardly anything.
That's still relatively unheard of, at least in the South.
Yes.
Yeah, which is,
So it's interesting that there was always turmoil in the background historically for these Josiahs. It was King Philip's War.
Yes.
The Revolutionary
There was a
War.
different breed of person. You had to survive, because if you didn't raise cattle, you didn't grow your crops, you didn't do anything, there was no supermarket to go to.
Yep.
There was no one else to rely on except your family and friends and your neighbors. And they had to worry, even when the house was built in 1717 and most of the wars between the Native Americans had ended, they even built places to hide in the house because they were still concerned about it. Mm-hmm. They carved all sorts of protections on the fireplace mantles and on the doors. They were worried about everything.
Yeah, well, they were also very
very superstitious.
Superstitious.
Very.
And so you showed us a sign that was put on the hearth and in the kitchen.
Yes.
And that was to keep the evil spirits away.
Yeah, they were worried about witches coming down the chimney.
Uh-huh.
Oh, yeah.
Well, we had witches well into the 18th century, luckily for them, because we weren't burning witches or hanging witches at that time. But the Buck family had witches from the middle part of the 1700s into almost the end of the 19th century.
What?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, my goodness.
Oh, yeah.
So were they punished or?
Nope. Everybody was scared of them.
Apparently, lots of people in this town made deals with the devil.
Yeah. And they had a useful function in the sense that they were oftentimes soothsayers.
Yes.
And they would tell you your future.
Mm.
The story of Nathan Seeley, one of the warlocks, was he was walking out of a house, and the girl of the house was walking in, and she said, "Oh, what's my future like?" And he didn't say anything, and he met a person out on the street, and he said, if she knew what's going to happen in the next week, she wouldn't have asked me. The girl died.
She did.
Yes. So.
They were also, the holders of knowledge in terms of medicine. And, when pharmacies were invented later in the 19th century, a lot of the college-educated men would go to these women to learn which plants and which vegetation to use to create certain medications. A lot that we even use today derived directly from the knowledge that these women had. It's quite amazing.
Yeah, it is amazing.
So, were there any women, to your knowledge, who had that particular
I don't think so in the
ability
family. No.
in the Josiah?
Not that I know of in the house, at least.
Yeah, that would be interesting to see. There were women who had a reputation as they weren't really doctors, but they were called bone setters.
Yeah.
So if somebody broke a leg, they could fix it so that it wouldn't get infected. And that's this herb stuff.
Yeah, I would imagine, though, the Keith's coming from Scotland, though, I would imagine they would keep some of the folk magic traditions coming from, they were in Aberdeen, right?
Yeah.
They were in Aberdeen, so, it's fairly not a great environment. So, people were always getting sick. It was always very damp and not dissimilar to where they were in Easton.
And there was actually a lot of witchcraft in Scotland.
Yeah.
King James the First actually wrote a book about witchcraft. King James of England was King James VI of Scotland and inherited the job after Queen Elizabeth died. And so witches were quite common. It'd be actually interesting to try to compare his book with what we know of some of the folk practices that were here.
Yeah.
And see how they matched up.
Oh yeah, there's behind the house in the Wheaton Farm area, there's all sorts of stone structures, and I have so directly behind my house there's a pyramid structure it may have been a land marker, but they could have been out in the woods doing who knows what.
That's a better possibility than the early deeds that say, in a tree with a robin's egg in it. Yeah.
No addresses.
No addresses.
No addresses whatsoever.
There weren't addresses on Bay Road until the 20th century.
Really?
Oh, yes.
Yep.
Yeah. If you read through the town history, as Ed just said, literally one of the addresses is in a tree with a blue robin's egg next to the pond.
Yep.
And do you know the address of the Josiah
No.
Keith house?
No, I don't think it was listed in the book, unfortunately. It would have been nice to know, though. But they would be fairly well known, being directly on Bay Road.
Well, the interesting thing in the last quarter, right before the Revolutionary War, the tavern markers were put up, the stone markers that we have. And while it wasn't in front of your house, it was in front of the Josiah Keith Tavern.
Oh, it was.
And as another sign of disrespect, something happened to that. And the legend was everybody was so angry they just moved the stone. But it turns out that the stone is in front of 345 Bay Road. And I did some research for Mass Historical Commission, and it turns out that house, which was a late 18th, early 19th century, was owned by Josiah Keith's daughter. And
oh, really?
I really believe that she moved the stone and put it there.
To protect
but
it?
His name was crossed off.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, he must have owed a lot of people a lot of money.
And that was Josiah the Third.
Josiah the Third.
So his way out was to commit suicide.
Yes.
Yes, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Which is sad, especially after living such a
Useful life.
very useful life. He's a tough man. And he must have, I imagine he probably had some post-traumatic stress as well from seeing what he did especially in New York. New York was terrible for us. It was.
You mean during the war?
Yeah,
Yes.
during the war.
As a militiaman?
As a militiaman. New York was probably the worst of the worst.
Josiah Keith wasn't the only captain of militia that committed suicide. Seth
No.
Burr also did that. and Alicia Harvey didn't commit suicide, but he became an alcoholic. He lived a long life, but he became completely dependent on alcohol.
Part of what I would like to tell in the story of the house when we eventually are open to the public is that, because I think it's very relatable to our soldiers coming home from Afghanistan and Iraq, and you know, the problems that they deal with, you know, the recession that we're going through, or whatever it was called. It's very relatable, very, very relatable to what's going on today. You know, especially post-Revolutionary War, there was no hard currency, so everyone's businesses were failing left and right, which led to Shays' Rebellion, and no one was happy. So I think it's a good story.
So tell me, what are your future plans?
So I've just received my nonprofit status. The house is going to be open to the public as a little house museum. We have built in the back a whole bunch of wattle fencing, which is not complete yet, but we will be completing it this winter. And we'll be growing everything that they would have grown back then. We'd be doing the Three Sisters, so that, you know, dent corn with squash and beans growing in it. We'll be growing a little bit of tobacco, some pumpkins. We'll have a whole herb garden and a medicinal herb garden, a little kitchen garden. And yeah, hopefully we'll have some more livestock as well. Right now I have some ducks, and hopefully we'll have some Scottish black-faced sheep in a few months as well. Yeah.
Those are exciting plans.
Oh yeah. So we'll have it open also to stay overnight. I was very fortunate as a child to be brought all over the country to these little house museums. I always wanted to stay in them. And now I have the ability to let people stay with me. It's a large house. It's 5 bedrooms. So I have 3 bedrooms upstairs that I'm going to rent out to people for the night, and if they want to stay with me.
And
so as a town official, scary. How's that going to work? You have to have 2 egresses, right? And the last time I was there, it was only those terrifying stairs.
Yeah, we have the fire escape ladders that we're purchasing.
Okay, that's cool. That's a good way to maintain the historical authenticity.
Yeah.
Good.
Yeah, the little rope ladders will be in every one of the rooms, which is a simple fix. Not too expensive, which is nice, because it is a beautifully framed home, and I wouldn't want to. In fact, I want to restore it more to what it would have looked like around 1790. I think some of the paint on the floors need to come up, and it's a labor of love. It's one thing at a time.
Sure.
Do you think they actually, that the issue of what's the first painted whatever in town is a big deal for some people? It's like, whoa, it was, Ames here in Northeastern in his little building that still stands.
Yeah.
And then people in Southeastern say, no, it was actually the Hayward House across the street from the regional school, which has been known since 1778 as the Red House because it was painted.
Yeah.
But painting on floors, that's an interesting thing.
Yeah. So some houses from the period would have had a black and white painted checker floor. But I'd never seen an example with white painted floors. And it looks like Mr. Williams probably painted it at one point. And the families had lived after continued the practice of painting the floor. But yeah, since the floors are pretty much original to when the house was restored the first time, or lowered down rather, I think I'm going to restore it back to that period, at least. Yeah.
Nice. That's going to be great.
Oh yeah.
So any other interesting fun facts that you can think of about the Josiah Keith house, or about the family members, or
like every other old house, we have shoes in the walls. Apparently, the Wares had found Mr. Keith's hanger sword, which someone, I think, took in the when they had the estate sale, unfortunately. So if anyone knows where it is, I'm looking for it. I'll pay top dollar for it.
So what is it?
It's Mr. Keith's sword he would have worn
Oh.
when he was in the militia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, a hanger is a type of sword that's practical rather than ceremonial, like some officers' swords.
I see.
Yes, which would be a wonderful thing to have, especially for the town. We're always looking for donations of furniture, period furniture.
So what period are you looking at?
So late to early, rather most anything in the 18th century to early 19th century. That's generally what the time period we're trying to concentrate on is.
So 1700s to the early 1800s.
Yeah, yeah, just before the Civil War.
So you're really covering the period that Sturbridge goes up to, maybe 1840, and coming back a little bit further.
Yeah.
And that's great. That's sort of the heyday of Bay Road.
Oh yeah.
And you know, even though we said traffic went the other way, but this was the heart of the agricultural part of town.
Oh yeah.
Because you could actually grow stuff in the soil down there rather than up here where it was more difficult.
Yeah. Yeah. Very. The terrain of the town is on the north side of the town is more glacial moraine, very rocky soil. Whereas down by me, you start getting into the peaty, mossy soil, and which is why they were grazing cattle there. It's a beautiful area. I've been very welcomed into the town, and I very much appreciate everyone being so friendly. I love it here.
Good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Well, we are so happy that you're here and that you're restoring the house the way it was meant to be.
Of course.
And that you take such loving care, because so many other people would want to modernize and bring some luxurious, comforting appointments to the house.
If I could get rid of the electricity and get rid of the faucets, and I'm going to eventually get rid of the radiators, I'd live like it was the 18th century. I'm very comfortable. I like the cold, and I don't mind lighting a fire to stay warm.
No, and every room has a fireplace.
Yes.
Yeah.
There's 5 fireplaces in the house, and
well, today when we were touring, there was a fire in the kitchen fireplace with a kettle hanging, and it was nice. It was comfortable.
Oh yeah.
And because there are no doors really on connecting rooms, that heat just keeps flowing around.
Oh yeah.
So it's very.
Well, that chimney is massive, so that builds up the heat and radiates it back out too. That's
true.
What makes it so much fun. Do you have any plans with that beautiful kitchen oven, or are you going to be cooking in there for your guests?
I have experience working at like 5 different pizzerias back in New York, where I'm from, and been cooking pizzas in it. It's wonderful, and it actually, like you said, it keeps the house warm, and it keeps the house warm better than actually the forced air induction steam heat, and it's wonderful.
Yeah, and what you're talking about is a oh, now I'm having a senior moment.
The radiators.
No, the oven.
Oh,
Dutch oven.
Yeah,
Dutch
the
oven,
brick
yes.
oven, yeah.
Dutch oven is the magic word, And you opened it up and showed us today, and it's just like a stone hearth, Italian stone hearth.
No flue in it, so you got to use charcoal or a very low smoke wood. You don't really want to have a fire in there, but you want that. You just want the.
So oak would be appropriate, wouldn't it?
Yeah, you want something low and slow. And
My grandmother lived in an old tavern in Scituate, and same kind of huge oven, and she actually baked in it just for fun. And you make a fire in your regular fireplace, and when the coals burn down, you put that in your oven to heat it up.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And there was no shortage of charcoal in Easton because of the iron industry.
Yes.
All worked on charcoal in those days.
Yes. lots of bog iron, tons and tons of bog iron, which is, I've had a theory as to why this was one of the most haunted towns in the country,
Most
or in
what
the
kind?
state. One of the most haunted towns in the in the
Yes.
state, rather. With the pine trees that we have around, the pine trees are very acidic, and with the bogs, you have water that are full of iron, and when you have an acid and metal, you have a giant battery. So there's a little bit of electricity in the air here, to say the least.
That's not a bad theory, actually.
And it reminds me that Furnace Village is named because of the furnaces that.
Keiths were involved in that.
Absolutely. Good old Zephaniah, Keith.
Yeah, and who made the cannonballs for the Revolutionary War?
Well, for the early part of the war, now you have to go back to 1752, a consortium, nobody had enough money to build a blast furnace by themselves. Blacksmiths could make a forge. That was expensive, but a blast furnace was a big investment. So a consortium of people, Matthew Haywood, who we talked about, Josiah, Zephaniah Keith, had shares. And then over the course of the next 30 years or so, people bought out other people's shares. So by the time the Revolution came around, the principal owner was James Perry, who lived probably down on South Street. Zephaniah Keith was the guy that had the real knowledge of running the foundry. And he stayed for the early part of the Revolution and then moved his family to Vermont.
Is he related to Josiah?
Yeah, they are all related.
Yeah. There's a ton of them.
Yes, because they all had large families.
And they're still in this town today.
Yeah, they're still Keiths.
Yeah, there's still Keiths here.
Yes. Well, I went to school. One of my classmates was Ann Keith.
Dot Berry was a Keith as well.
Oh, she was?
Yep.
Interesting.
Oh, yeah. It's very interesting. I love the fact that I met, do you remember his name? He's hard of hearing.
Oh, Paul? Keith?
Paul, yeah,
Paul
that's
Keith.
Paul.
Yeah, Paul Keith.
Paul Berry. He's
Paul Berry,
he's
yeah.
Oh, yeah, Paul Berry.
he's the son of Dot.
Dot, yeah.
He's very proud of being a Keith.
Oh, yes.
To the point where he's restoring the grave markers.
Is he really? That's wonderful.
Yeah.
I took a picture of him, and I'm a little bit of an artist, so hopefully I'll do a portrait of him in the early 18th century clothes, so I can get an idea of what Josiah Keith would have looked like. Just because we have not found any images of them. They were relatively well off, but not well off enough to have had a portrait done of them, I think.
I could get you the information on just how well off they are.
They were?
There's a 1771 evaluation.
Oh, really?
And way back when Robert Gross, this famous historian up in Concord, showed people how you just line them up in a row and then divide them into tenths, who's in the top tenth and who's one. So I did that for Easton. I don't remember where Josiah finished, but it's certainly in the top half.
Very much appreciate that.
Yeah, I will do that for you. Yep.
Well, it's wonderful that you're going to you have had a collaboration. Yes. Today you're collaborating, and you will be collaborating in the future for the benefit of Easton residents.
Of course.
And we appreciate that.
That's part of the mission goal for the nonprofit, is to preserve the house and the history of the town and the local area in general. Most of the furniture I've bought for the house has been down in Taunton or New Bedford, which were the major manufacturing centers for furniture in New England. You know, they were making copies of Heppelwitt furniture and just, you know, every style, Queen Anne stuff. And I want to keep this stuff here because it deserves to be here, and the people who live here deserve to see it. Doesn't need to be spread out all over the country. It should be here where it was made, and this is where it'll stay.
Well, thank you. Justin LeWinter.
Of course.
Ed Hands, thank you both for
Pleasure.
sharing all of these wonderful stories and having this lovely conversation. Appreciate everything you have done, and also Ed, all the wonderful work that you have completed as one of our epic historians. And I'm going to have you back because to talk about Richardson, Henry Hobson Richardson, but also about Mr. Chafin and some of the stories that he tells in that History of Easton book that he wrote. And
Very good book.
and
Full of history.
and you've been reading it.
Oh yeah, of course.
Yeah, there's good stories in there.
Yes.
Most people are daunted by the fact that it's like a foot and a half thick, but it's worth.
It is, and it's divided into chapters, so you can just read it one chapter at a time. You don't have to read the whole thing.
Before we got on air, we were talking about how the town went through 3 stockades in a short amount of time. A lot of drinking going on here. A lot of partying. It was a crazy place early on here.
No. It was a crazy place when I was in high school, too. We took a field trip to the prison, and they said, oh, yeah, we have a lot of people here from Easton. They're all alcoholics.
On that note,
Yeah.
we will say thank you again to both of you. And to our viewing audience, I hope you've enjoyed this program and conversation as much as we have enjoyed providing it. Thank you for watching. Until next time, be well.